What if everything you thought you knew about this moment was backwards? What if the palace didn't release that statement out of concern, but out of control? And what if the so-called tragic update about Meghan Markle's future wasn't tragic for the reason the public believes, but because it quietly confirms something far more final? Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. Because here's the part that should make you stop scrolling. This wasn't a sudden development, it wasn't emotional, and it definitely wasn't accidental. It was timed. 5 minutes ago. That's what the headline screamed. As if the palace had just learned something shocking. As if events were still unfolding. As if there was still room for change. But insiders tell a very different story. This wasn't breaking news. It was confirmation. And those two things are not the same. Confirmation means the decision was already made. Confirmation means discussions were already closed. Confirmation means whatever door people think is still open may have been shut long before the public ever noticed. So let me ask you something uncomfortable. If Meghan Markle is quietly trying to rebuild ties with the palace, why would the palace choose this exact moment to go public? Not last year, not during earlier controversies, not when speculation was loudest. Why now? Because timing in royal circles is never neutral. And that's where this story really begins. For months, quietly, deliberately, and almost invisibly, something has been shifting behind the scenes. Not in the tabloids, not on red carpets, not in carefully curated appearances, but in tone, in access, in silence. Because the most dangerous moment in any power struggle isn't when people are arguing. It's when one side stops responding altogether. At first, nothing looked different on the surface. Public smiles, controlled narratives. The same recycled talking points about independence, reinvention, and moving forward. But behind closed doors, something colder was happening. Messages went unanswered. Intermediaries stopped returning calls. Conversations that once felt possible suddenly felt inappropriate. And here's where the contradiction hits. While the public was being told that bridges could still be rebuilt, the palace was quietly removing the river. You see, returning to the UK isn't just about geography. It's about legitimacy. It's about proximity to power. It's about being seen, not as an outsider looking in, but as someone still relevant to the institution that defines global royalty. And that relevance? It's not automatic. It has to be granted. Which brings us to the rumor that refuses to go away. The secret return plan, not a grand comeback, not a balcony appearance, not even a formal role, but a gradual re-entry. Soft optics, low visibility, carefully controlled interactions. The kind of return that doesn't make headlines unless someone wants it to. And suddenly, that's exactly what happened. A palace confirmation, carefully worded, emotionally vague, strategically devastating. No direct accusations, no open hostility. Just enough clarity to send a message. And the message wasn't sympathy. It was finality. Because if this were about compassion, it would have been handled privately. If this were about reconciliation, it would have been delayed. If this were about healing, it wouldn't have needed confirmation at all. Institutions don't confirm hope. They confirm outcomes. So what outcome was being locked in? This is where the word tragic starts to take on a different meaning. Not tragic as in loss of status, not tragic as in emotional pain. Tragic as in realization, the realization that leverage has shifted. The realization that influence has diminished. The realization that wanting back in is not the same as being welcomed. And that realization doesn't hit all at once. It creeps in. It starts with small things. An invitation that never arrives. A conversation that stays under review. A silence that stretches just a little too long until one day the palace speaks and says nothing at all. That's what stunned insiders. The absence of reassurance. The lack of warmth. The deliberate neutrality. Because neutrality in royal language is often rejection in its cleanest form. And here's the uncomfortable truth no one wants to say out loud. Trying to return to an institution you once challenged is not a reset. It's a negotiation. And negotiations only work when both sides need something. So ask yourself honestly, what does the palace need right now? Stability. Control. Predictability. What it does not need is disruption. Which explains why this confirmation landed not like a scandal, but like a warning. A warning to stop speculating. A warning to stop assuming. a warning that certain paths are no longer being entertained. And yet the public narrative keeps insisting she wants back in. That part may be true, but wanting is not deciding. And here's where the story turns personal. Because this isn't just about Meghan Markle, it's about misreading power, about assuming relevance is permanent, about believing that visibility equals influence. It doesn't. Institutions outlast individuals, and the palace has waited out stronger storms than this. Which raises the most dangerous question of all. What if the return plan wasn't rejected loudly, but quietly neutralized? What if by the time the confirmation came, there was nothing left to negotiate? And what if this tragic update wasn't about the future being uncertain, but about it being settled? Because insiders suggest the real blow wasn't the statement itself. It was the timing, released just as whispers of re-engagement began circulating, just as speculation about soft reconciliation gained traction, just as expectations were being recalibrated. That's not coincidence. That's containment. And containment only happens when something is perceived as a risk. So what exactly was the palace trying to contain? The narrative? The expectations? Or the possibility that this story would spiral out of their control? Because once you understand that, everything else starts to make sense. The distance, the silence, the carefully chosen words, and the cold realization that in royal dynamics, doors don't always slam. Sometimes they simply stop existing. But here's the part no one is ready for yet. This confirmation wasn't the end of the story. It was the signal that the next phase had already begun, because while the public was still reacting, the palace was already moving forward. And once you see what triggered that shift and who quietly influenced it, you'll understand why this moment wasn't tragic because of what was said, but because of what will never be offered again. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. What if the most important part of the palace's statement was the part everyone skimmed past? Not the headline, not the timing, not even the carefully chosen phrases that news anchors repeated on loop. What if the real message was hidden in the calm? Because the moment the palace confirmed the update, something fundamental shifted, and almost no one noticed it happening in real time. The public saw a reaction. Insiders saw a conclusion. And that difference matters more than people realize. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. That line wasn't just dramatic punctuation. It was literal. Within minutes of the confirmation going live, phones began lighting up in places the public will never see. Advisors checking in, former intermediaries exchanging quiet messages, courtiers reading between the lines the way only they know how. Because when an institution like Buckingham Palace speaks, it is never speaking to everyone equally. The public hears reassurance. The insiders hear instruction. And the instruction this time was unmistakable. Why confirm anything at all? Think about it. For years, the palace mastered the art of saying nothing. Silence became its most powerful weapon. When speculation exploded, they waited it out. When narratives spiraled, they let them burn themselves out. So why break that pattern now? Why issue a confirmation about the future of Meghan Markle? Especially when ambiguity would have served them better. Because ambiguity invites hope. And hope was exactly what the palace needed to shut down. The wording was surgical. No emotion, no apology, no reconciliation language, no forward-looking promises, just acknowledgement. An acknowledgement, in royal terms, is not an opening. It's a seal. People forget this, but confirmations are not reactions to pressure. They are responses to planning. Pressure creates denials. Planning creates confirmations. Which means the decision existed before the announcement, long before. Sources close to the institution describe it as a moment of alignment. Internal discussions that had been drifting for months suddenly snapped into focus, not because of something Meghan did publicly, not because of a single interview or appearance, but because of what was happening quietly, behind the scenes. The return whispers, the subtle feelers, the indirect messages, the reactivation of channels that had gone cold. On their own, none of these moves were explosive. In fact, they were careful, almost cautious, which is precisely why they triggered concern, because the palace understands subtlety better than anyone. And subtlety often signals strategy. Here's the contradiction. No one wants to confront. If Meghan truly had no intention of reconnecting with the UK institutionally, there would have been no need for the palace to speak. If the door were truly irrelevant, it wouldn't need to be addressed. So why address it? Because something, or someone, was getting too close to it. This is where the myth of spontaneity collapses. The palace didn't wake up one morning and decide to clarify Meghan's future. It reacted to a trajectory that insiders feared would create assumptions that could harden into expectations that would be far more dangerous to dismantle later. So they moved early, quietly, decisively, publicly. And that public confirmation did something remarkable. It froze the narrative. Overnight, speculation shifted from "will she return" to "why did they shut it down?" That's not an accident. That's narrative control. But let's talk about the timing, because timing is where this story turns sharp. This confirmation didn't come during peak controversy. It didn't follow a major public clash. It didn't trail a viral moment. It came during a lull, a moment when attention was diffused, when pressure was low, when people weren't looking for drama. That's when institutions strike, because moves made in quiet moments don't feel like attacks. They feel like facts. And facts are much harder to argue with. The palace framed the update as routine, as clarification, as necessary housekeeping. But insiders recognized it instantly for what it was: a boundary. Not a punishment, not a condemnation, a boundary. And boundaries are far more permanent. To understand why this confirmation mattered so much, you have to understand how the palace thinks about time. Individuals think in months. Institutions think in decades. From that perspective, Meghan's future isn't about her next move. It's about precedent. What happens if reintegration appears possible? What message does that send to others who might challenge the institution? What happens if distance no longer has consequences? These are not emotional questions. They're structural ones. And structural always wins. This is where many viewers will feel a twinge of discomfort, because the narrative they've been fed is emotional, human, relatable. A woman wanting to reconnect, a desire to rebuild bridges, a hope for closure. But the palace doesn't negotiate in emotional terms. It negotiates in stability. And stability, in this case, required clarity. So the confirmation arrived. No hostility, no warmth, just finality. The most telling part wasn't what was said, it was what wasn't included. No ongoing discussions, no open dialogue, no future possibilities. Those phrases are the currency of institutions when they want to buy time. Their absence tells you time has already run out, which brings us to the quiet role of the monarch himself. King Charles III is often portrayed as torn, caught between personal feeling and public duty. That tension is real. But here's the truth that rarely gets discussed. By the time a palace confirmation is released, the monarch is no longer deciding. He is ratifying. The debate has already happened. The consequences have already been weighed. The risks have already been assessed. What remains is execution. And execution in this case was clean. That's why the tone felt so cold to some observers. But coldness implies cruelty. This wasn't cruelty. It was precision. And precision is far more dangerous, because it doesn't invite appeal. Within hours of the confirmation, subtle shifts followed. Journalists who once hinted at reconciliation suddenly changed language. Sources who once teased possible returns went quiet. Commentary softened, not in sympathy, but in certainty. Everyone adjusted, except the public, because the public was still processing the idea of tragedy, still asking, what went wrong? The insiders were asking a different question entirely. Why did it take this long? According to those familiar with internal thinking, the palace delayed confirmation deliberately, waiting to see whether the return momentum would fade on its own. It didn't, so they intervened. And that intervention sent a message not just to Meghan, but to everyone watching closely. There is a difference between absence and exclusion. Absence can be reversed. Exclusion cannot. The confirmation didn't accuse Meghan of anything. It didn't relitigate old conflicts. It didn't reopen wounds. It simply removed ambiguity. And ambiguity is the oxygen of reinvention. Without it, options collapse. Here's where the emotional beat hits hardest. For anyone hoping that time alone could heal this rift, the confirmation was devastating. Because time wasn't the problem, timing was. And timing, once missed, doesn't loop back around. Which brings us to the part that's hardest to accept. This wasn't the palace reacting to Meghan's past. It was reacting to her future. to the possibility of a narrative shift they no longer controlled. And control, to an institution built on continuity, is everything. So the confirmation landed. Calm, measured, irreversible. And just like that, the conversation changed. Not from will she return, but from why was the door closed so publicly? That question leads somewhere uncomfortable, because it suggests the palace wasn't afraid of rejection. It was afraid of re-entry. And once you understand that fear, once you see what triggered it, the rest of this story snaps into focus. Because the confirmation wasn't the end, it was the beginning of a deeper freeze. One that would soon expose the true cost of wanting back in after walking away. But the most shocking part? The palace didn't act alone. And the influence that tipped the scales is something no one was supposed to notice. But what came next would expose exactly who pushed this confirmation over the edge, and why that influence changes everything. What if the tragedy everyone keeps talking about was never meant to be understood, not clarified, not explained, not even agreed upon? What if its power came precisely from the fact that no one defined it? Because the moment the palace used that word, tragedy, without context, it did something subtle and devastating at the same time. It let the public fill in the blanks. And once people start filling in blanks emotionally, they stop asking structural questions. That's how narratives harden. But insiders didn't hear tragedy the way the public did. They heard closure. Let me ask you something uncomfortable. When an institution like the palace refers to something as tragic, whose tragedy do you think they're acknowledging? The individuals or the institutions? Because those are not the same thing. The public interpretation was immediate and human. A tragic turn, a difficult future, a woman facing loss, rejection, isolation. It was sympathetic, it was emotional, it was safe. But that reading missed the point. Inside royal circles, tragedy doesn't mean sadness. It means inevitability. It means something has reached a point where no elegant solution exists anymore. Something has been allowed to run its course. And now consequences are unavoidable. That's why no one rushed to clarify the word. Clarification would have softened it. And the palace didn't want softness. They wanted finality to land without sounding cruel. So tragedy was left undefined. Here's the paradox that makes this chapter uncomfortable. The tragedy wasn't about what Meghan lost. It was about what the palace refused to risk. And to understand that, you have to rewind, not to the public split, not to the interviews, not even to the early fallout. You have to rewind to the moment when the possibility of return still felt theoretical. At first, the idea of re-entry wasn't alarming. Institutions expect people to drift back emotionally. Nostalgia is normal. Regret is human. But nostalgia becomes dangerous when it turns into strategy. That's when tragedy enters the conversation. Because strategy implies leverage, and leverage implies negotiation. Which brings us back to the quiet realization that unsettled the palace. Meghan wasn't simply missing the UK. She was reassessing relevance, and reassessment in royal politics is not passive. It's preparatory. That realization reframed everything. Suddenly, the question wasn't, does she want back in? It became, what happens if she comes back partially? Because partial returns are the most destabilizing. They blur lines. They confuse hierarchy. They reopen arguments everyone thought were settled. And institutions hate blurred lines. So the tragedy, from their perspective, wasn't emotional pain. It was the loss of clarity, the loss of clean separation, the loss of a narrative they could keep contained. Think about it. A full return would have required formal agreements, visible boundaries, and institutional oversight. A full rejection would have required nothing at all. But a quiet, informal re-entry? That was the nightmare scenario. Because informal access creates informal power. And informal power is impossible to regulate. That's why the palace acted when it did. They weren't responding to heartbreak. They were responding to ambiguity, which reframes the tragedy completely. The tragedy wasn't that Meghan might never return. The tragedy was that she might try and fail. Because failure, once visible, becomes permanent. Hope can be revisited. Failure gets archived. This is where the emotional beat deepens. For anyone who has ever tried to go back to a job, a relationship, a place that once defined them, this story hits close to home. Because returning isn't just about showing up. It's about whether the environment still has space for the person you've become. And institutions don't adapt to individuals. Individuals adapt to institutions, or they're excluded. The palace understood this early. That's why they let the idea of tragedy hang in the air. It allowed the public to empathize while insulating the institution from blame. People could mourn the situation without questioning the structure that caused it. That's not accidental. That's narrative architecture. And it worked. But there was another layer to the tragedy that most people missed entirely: the tragedy of miscalculation. Because while the public saw emotion, insiders saw timing errors. The sense that something had been attempted too late, too quietly, too cautiously, after leverage had already shifted. Here's the hard truth. Institutions remember who challenges them, not with anger, with data. They catalog moments, they track outcomes, they note patterns. And once you fall into a pattern, especially one associated with instability, every future move is interpreted through that lens. That's the real tragedy. Not rejection, but predictability. The palace didn't see a woman seeking reconciliation. They saw a sequence repeating: public distance, private frustration, quiet outreach, narrative repositioning. They'd seen it before. And institutions don't give second chances to patterns. They give second chances to people who demonstrate structural alignment. That alignment never came, which raises another question. Why didn't Meghan push harder, louder, more directly? Why the secrecy? Why the caution? Because pushing publicly would have backfired, and she knew it. Public pressure creates resistance. Private overtures create possibility. At least, that's how it works, when possibility still exists. But by the time the overtures began, the internal calculus had already changed. The palace no longer viewed re-entry as a neutral option. It was now a risk, and when something becomes a risk, tragedy becomes inevitable. Not because someone must suffer, but because the outcome narrows to a single acceptable path. That path, in this case, was distance. This is where the story becomes deeply ironic. The more carefully Meghan tried to approach the idea of return, the more it alarmed the institution. Because care implies intention, and intention implies planning, which is why the palace's use of tragedy was so effective. It framed the outcome as sad but unavoidable, natural rather than strategic, emotional rather than institutional. But insiders knew better. They understood that tragedy was code. Code for, this cannot be undone without cost. And that cost was one the palace refused to pay. Which brings us to the most painful realization of this chapter. Tragedy, in royal terms, doesn't mean someone loses everything. It means everyone loses options. And when options disappear, stories end quietly. Not with explosions, not with scandals, but with confirmations. The tragedy no one defined was never meant to be debated. It was meant to be accepted. And acceptance is the final stage of any power shift. But here's where the tension spikes. Because not everyone accepted it. Behind the scenes, questions were still being asked by advisors, by intermediaries, by people who believed something else was influencing this outcome. Something beyond policy, beyond precedent, something personal. And once those questions started circulating, a new realization emerged. The tragedy wasn't just institutional, it was interpersonal, because someone close to the center had quietly changed their position. And that shift, subtle but decisive, altered the entire equation. The palace didn't just respond to a situation. It responded to advice. Advice that reframed risk. Advice that emphasized containment. Advice that warned, if this door opens even slightly, it may never close again. And once that advice landed, tragedy stopped being a word. It became a strategy. But the most unsettling part, the person who delivered that advice wasn't acting out of hostility. They were acting out of protection. Protection of the crown. Protection of continuity. Protection of a future they believed was at stake. And that means the next chapter isn't really about Meghan at all. It's about the quiet shift behind palace walls. The moment when neutrality hardened into resolve. The moment when tragedy stopped being an outcome and became a justification. Because once you see who influenced that shift and why, you'll understand that this story was never about return. It was about prevention. But what came next would reveal exactly when the palace decided the risk was too great. and why that decision changed the tone forever. What if the most decisive moment in this entire saga didn't happen in public at all? Not during an interview, not during a headline cycle, not during a confrontation anyone could quote. What if it happened in silence? Because while the public was still debating what the palace meant, something far more important was already underway behind closed doors. A shift. Not loud, not dramatic, but unmistakable to those who know how to listen. Here's the unsettling truth most people miss. Institutions don't change their mind suddenly. They change their posture first, and posture is everything. The shift behind palace walls didn't announce itself with outrage or urgency. It arrived as something colder and more disciplined. Distance. The kind of distance that isn't emotional, it's procedural. At first, it looked like nothing at all. A meeting postponed, a response delayed, a conversation rerouted through one extra layer of formality. Small things, easy to dismiss. But for those who understand how the palace operates, these were signals that the internal mood had changed. Because the palace doesn't slam doors. It reorganizes hallways. To understand this shift, you have to understand how access works in royal systems. Access is not granted by affection. It's granted by usefulness. And usefulness is always contextual. For a long time, the palace tolerated ambiguity because it served a purpose. Distance reduced friction. Silence diffused conflict. Letting narratives play out externally protected the institution internally. But ambiguity has a shelf life. And once that shelf life expires, tolerance turns into risk assessment. That's exactly what happened here. As whispers of possible re-engagement circulated, they didn't spark panic. They sparked evaluation. Quiet, methodical evaluation. Who would benefit? Who would lose control? What precedent would be set? These questions weren't asked emotionally, they were asked structurally. And once those questions entered the room, the tone changed. Because tone always changes when risk is introduced. People who once spoke casually became precise. Language tightened. Neutral phrases replaced open-ended ones. Instead of, let's see, it became, we'll review. Instead of possibly, it became unlikely at this time. Those aren't just words, they're walls. And walls, once erected, don't come down easily. Here's where the contradiction deepens. The palace wasn't reacting to Meghan herself. It was reacting to what her return would represent. A reversal. And reversals are dangerous for institutions built on continuity. Continuity isn't about never changing. It's about changing slowly, deliberately, and without admitting instability. A visible return, even a quiet one, would have undermined that, because it would suggest that separation was temporary, that challenges were negotiable, that walking away didn't permanently alter status, and that was unacceptable. So the palace did what it always does when facing unacceptable uncertainty. It slowed everything down. Meetings became fewer. Timelines became vague. Decisions moved upward and then disappeared. This wasn't passive resistance. It was strategic inertia. The goal wasn't to provoke, it was to exhaust momentum. And momentum is fragile when it relies on discretion, because discretion requires cooperation. Once cooperation fades, discretion collapses. That's when the shift became visible, not to the public, but to those who expected doors to open quietly and instead found them politely closed. One insider described it as the temperature dropping, not hostile, just cold. And cold environments don't support regrowth. They preserve. This is the part of the story that feels deeply human, because anyone who's ever tried to return to a place they left understands this sensation. You don't get told no. You get told nothing. And nothing is far more powerful, because nothing forces you to interpret. And interpretation is where doubt creeps in. Was the timing wrong? Was the approach flawed? Was the interest mutual? That doubt creates hesitation. Hesitation kills initiative. And initiative is the lifeblood of return. By the time the palace issued its confirmation, the shift had already done its work. Momentum was gone. Options were narrowing. What remained was clarity. But there was another layer to the shift, one that rarely gets discussed: the internal consensus. Institutions don't move forward unless key stakeholders align. And alignment doesn't mean enthusiasm. It means absence of objection. That absence is critical, Because at one point, objections did exist. Concerns were raised. Alternatives were floated. Caution was advised. But over time, those objections faded. Not because they were resolved, but because they were outweighed. By what? By fear of reopening cycles, the palace believed it had already survived. Cycles of distraction, cycles of division, cycles of narrative instability. And that fear hardened into resolve. This is where the shift became irreversible. Because once an institution decides something must be prevented, not just managed, everything changes. Prevention requires clarity. Prevention requires messaging. Prevention requires public positioning. That's when the idea of confirmation moved from hypothetical to necessary. But before that happened, one final internal recalibration took place. A recalibration that centered on optics, not public optics. Inte. The first thing people noticed wasn't what was said. It was the silence. A silence that arrived suddenly. A silence that replaced years of noise, obsession, fury, headlines, interviews, monologues, tweets, and public battles. A silence that made even the loudest critics stop and ask a question they had never asked before. Why now? Why stop now? And more importantly, what happened behind the scenes that nobody was supposed to see? For years, the clash between Piers Morgan and Meghan Markle played out like a global spectacle. Television studios, morning shows, viral clips, Twitter storms, book releases, public statements, counter-statements. It wasn't just commentary. It was personal, or at least that's how it felt. And when something feels personal, people eventually start asking the question no one wants to ask out loud. How personal was it really? Because normal criticism doesn't linger like this. Normal professional disagreements don't harden into years of fixation. Normal media feuds don't follow someone across continents, marriages, job losses, and life reinventions. So when whispers began circulating, quiet ones, off-camera ones, ones never meant for headlines, people leaned in. Not because they wanted gossip, but because they sensed contradiction, a public story that didn't fully match the private one. And then came the most unexpected development of all. A voice that had never been part of the spectacle before. Not a tabloid, not a rival broadcaster, not a royal commentator, but the person closest to the storm and farthest from the spotlight, his wife. Not through a dramatic press conference, not through a headline-grabbing interview, but through subtle signals, timing, body language, conversations that suddenly stopped, social shifts that didn't align with the public narrative. And that's where this story truly begins. Because when the person who has every incentive to stay quiet starts changing how they move, speak, and react, people notice. Especially when the stakes involve power, reputation, loyalty, and something far more fragile than public image: trust. So, let's rewind. Not to the headlines you already know, but to the moments you likely missed. The early interactions that didn't make the news. The overlapping timelines no one lined up side by side. The messages that were described, but never shown. The professional lines that blurred, not publicly, but emotionally. And the uncomfortable truth that sits at the center of it all. Sometimes the most explosive stories aren't about what happened, they're about what nearly did. Here's what makes this story matter right now. In the last year, public interest in this long-running feud has cooled. At least on the surface, the outrage cycles have moved on. The culture war has found new battlefields. But behind the scenes, something shifted. Media insiders began describing a hard stop, a noticeable disengagement that didn't match the years of obsession that came before it. Colleagues whispered about conversations that abruptly ended. Friends noticed a recalibration at home, and audiences started asking a dangerous question. What caused the switch? Because people don't just wake up one day and emotionally detach from a fixation that's defined them for years. Something interrupts it. Something forces reflection. Something introduces consequences. And consequences, in stories like this, almost always involve the people standing closest to the fire. The irony here is almost too perfect. A man known for calling others out. A woman known for polarizing public perception. A marriage forced to exist under the microscope of relentless commentary. And somewhere between outrage and obsession, a line that should never be crossed began to feel flexible. Now, let's be clear. This is not a story about a confirmed scandal. It's not about secret hotel rooms or hidden photographs. It's not about sensational claims masquerading as facts. It's about something far more believable and far more dangerous. Emotional proximity, the kind that develops slowly, quietly, behind professional justification. The kind people don't notice until it's already changed the atmosphere in the room. Ask yourself this. Have you ever watched someone argue so intensely about another person that you wondered why they cared so much? Have you ever seen criticism cross into fixation? Have you ever noticed how outrage can sometimes mask fascination? That's the tension at the heart of this story. And it's why the perspective of a spouse, someone with nothing to gain from spectacle, suddenly matters more than any headline ever did. Because spouses notice patterns before the world does. They notice the late-night phone checks, the emotional spikes tied to one specific name, the mood shifts after certain interviews air, the conversations that dominate dinner tables long after the cameras turn off. And when those patterns repeat, questions form, questions that don't need answers to be destabilizing. What exactly is being invested here? Why does this person still matter so much? And at what point does professional outrage become something else entirely? The public narrative told us this was about principle, about journalism, about truth. But private life rarely follows public scripts, and that's where this story separates itself from everything you've heard before. Because when insiders began quietly suggesting that the issue wasn't just what was said on television, but what followed after, the focus shifted. From broadcasts to boundaries, from opinions to impact, from Meghan Markle and Piers Morgan as public adversaries to the collateral damage created by prolonged fixation. And once you start examining it through that lens, details that once seemed insignificant suddenly feel loaded. The timing of comments, the emotional intensity behind them, the personal language used in moments that were supposed to be professional, the way disengagement only happened after consequences appeared closer to home. Coincidence? Maybe. But coincidence is rarely satisfying when too many patterns align. Which brings us to the most uncomfortable part of this entire story. The part that rarely gets discussed because it implicates everyone watching, the audience, because public feuds don't survive without attention. They don't escalate without applause. And they don't blur boundaries without reinforcement. Every clip shared, every argument replayed, every moment turned into entertainment. At what point did outrage become encouragement? At what point did performance replace perspective? And at what point did the people closest to the situation realize something had gone too far? This isn't about villains and heroes. It's about human behavior under relentless visibility. And it's about the moment someone closest to the storm quietly decides, enough. But what exactly triggered that decision? What was said, or nearly said, behind closed doors? What realization forced a recalibration that no public apology could fix? And why did the shift happen when it did? Not earlier, not later, but right when the narrative seemed locked in place. That question sits at the center of everything that follows. Because in the next chapter, we're going to trace the origins of this fixation, not from the headlines, but from the earliest interactions that shaped it. The moments before it became a spectacle. The language that hinted at personal investment. And the first signs that this was never going to stay purely professional. And once you see how it began, you may never look at how it ended the same way again. This section is complete. Say go when you're ready for Chapter 1, where we examine how a professional disagreement quietly evolved into something far more consuming, and why no one stopped it when they still could. Each time I type GO, continue by generating the next section of the script based on the outline. Rules for continuation: pick up directly from the last cliffhanger. Length: at least 2,000 words. Retention style: begin with a mini hook or provocative question. Weave in emotional beats, contradictions, and surprising twists. Use short punchy lines for tension, longer ones for storytelling. Ask direct questions to the audience. Always end on a cliffhanger. Process: if you have not yet reached 2,000 words, stop and wait for me to say go. When you finish a section, state clearly that it's complete. Style: conversational, dramatic, YouTube expose tone. No fluff, no bolding. Got it. I'm locked in on those rules and ready to continue the moment you type GO. When you do, I'll pick up directly from the last cliffhanger, deliver the next full section, 2,000 plus words. Keep the same dramatic expose tone, pacing, and retention mechanics. End on a hard cliffhanger, clearly state when the section is complete. Whenever you're ready, type GO. Go Chapter 1. How it started, unto 000 plus words. What if the story everyone thinks they know didn't actually start with outrage, but with recognition. Not agreement, not admiration, recognition. Because long before the feud became a global spectacle, there was something quieter unfolding beneath it. A sequence of moments so ordinary they escaped scrutiny at the time, yet so specific they now feel impossible to ignore. Ask yourself this: how many public critics can recall in detail the very first time they encountered the person they later became obsessed with? Most can't. But in this case, the origin story was never vague. It was precise, personal, and emotionally charged in ways that professional disagreements rarely are. The early interaction wasn't explosive. It wasn't headline-worthy. It didn't trigger outrage or backlash. It felt familiar, and familiarity in media dynamics is dangerous. Because when someone feels familiar, they stop being abstract. They stop being a subject. They become a presence. And once someone becomes a presence, commentary stops being purely analytical. It becomes reactive. Here's the first contradiction most people missed. The earliest references weren't hostile. They weren't scathing. They weren't dismissive. They were animated. There was enthusiasm in the retelling, energy in the tone, specificity in the details. Notice how often critics generalize when they don't care. Notice how rarely they remember exact moments, exact phrases, exact emotional beats. But in this case, the recollections were vivid. And vivid memories usually mean one thing: emotional imprint. This is where the narrative diverges from the version people repeat online. Because before the public fallout, there was a sense of being personally wronged, not politically challenged, not professionally undermined, but personally unsettled. And personal reactions change everything. When commentary becomes personal, objectivity collapses. When objectivity collapses, boundaries blur. And when boundaries blur, fixation begins to masquerade as principle. Let's slow this down. Early coverage framed the dynamic as a clash of values. But watch closely. Values don't trigger repeated emotional spikes. They don't cause people to revisit the same subject endlessly. They don't inspire language that drips with familiarity. Personal feelings do. And here's where timing matters. The escalation didn't happen overnight. It unfolded in stages. First came interest, then commentary, then repetition, then escalation, then obsession. Each phase fed the next, and no one stepped in to interrupt it. Why would they? Ratings climbed, clips went viral. Audience engagement exploded. Outrage sells, and outrage directed at a single figure sells even better. So the cycle reinforced itself. The more attention the commentary received, the more intense it became. The more intense it became, the more personal it felt. And the more personal it felt, the harder it became to disengage. This is the psychological trap most people underestimate. Critics don't always realize when they've crossed from commentary into attachment. Attachment doesn't always look like affection. Sometimes it looks like anger. Sometimes it looks like fixation. Sometimes it looks like a need to respond to every perceived slight. Have you ever argued with someone so often that they began occupying mental space even when they weren't present? That's attachment. And once attachment forms, disengagement feels like loss. This is where the story starts to feel uncomfortable, because professional critics are supposed to rotate subjects. They're supposed to move on. They're supposed to evolve with the news cycle. But this subject didn't rotate. It anchored. Every new development became a trigger. Every appearance reignited the same emotional cadence. Every headline pulled the focus back again and again. And when something keeps pulling you back, the question isn't why the subject persists. It's why the response does. Now imagine what that looks like from the inside of a marriage. Not the headlines, not the public persona, the quiet moments, the conversations that loop, the moods that shift after broadcasts, the name that keeps reappearing in discussions that were supposed to be about something else. Spouses notice patterns long before outsiders do. They notice when criticism stops being reactive and starts being ritualistic. They notice when commentary doesn't end with the show, when it follows into private space, when it lingers, and linger it did. Which brings us to a moment few people talk about, the point where the narrative stopped being about what was said publicly and started being about how it was said. Tone changed, language sharpened, sarcasm gave way to bitterness. The humor that once framed commentary began to disappear. replaced by something heavier. That shift matters because humor suggests distance, bitterness suggests investment, and investment, once exposed, raises questions no one wants to answer. Why does this still matter so much? Why is disengagement impossible? Why does silence feel like surrender? At this stage, the public story framed everything as righteous anger. But righteousness doesn't explain fixation. Righteousness doesn't explain repetition. Righteousness doesn't explain why the commentary intensified even when consequences mounted. This is the paradox at the center of Chapter 1. The more professional risk increased, the harder it became to stop, which suggests the motivation wasn't purely professional. Now let's talk about something even more revealing: language. Words chosen unconsciously reveal emotional states. Notice how often the commentary drifted into personal descriptors rather than actions. Notice how motivations were inferred rather than analyzed. Notice how certainty replaced speculation. That's not journalism. That's narrative ownership. And narrative ownership creates a sense of entitlement, an entitlement to respond, to correct, to dominate the conversation. When someone feels entitled to a narrative, stepping away feels like losing control. And losing control can feel unbearable. This is where things begin to press against invisible lines, professional lines, emotional lines, domestic lines, because obsession doesn't announce itself loudly. It creeps, it normalizes itself through repetition, until one day, someone on the outside, often the person closest, realizes the atmosphere has changed, and atmosphere matters. Atmosphere shapes relationships more than words ever could. So ask yourself this: at what point does public commentary become private burden? At what point does media fixation turn into emotional leakage? At what point does a spouse stop hearing analysis and start hearing obsession? Those questions don't require proof to be destabilizing. They require proximity. And proximity is something the audience never has, but partners always do. By the end of this phase, something subtle had already shifted. The feud was no longer just content. It was context. Context for moods. Context for conversations. Context for tension. And once a subject becomes context, removing it requires more than willpower. It requires a reckoning, but that reckoning didn't come immediately. Instead, the situation intensified. The public believed the story was escalating outward, but the real escalation was happening inward, inside homes, inside marriages, inside conversations that never made headlines. And in the next chapter, we're going to examine the moment that changed everything, the moment when commentary collided with consequence. Because when professional behavior starts to threaten personal stability, the response is never subtle. And what followed wasn't a public explosion. It was something far more telling, a recalibration. But what triggered it? What moment forced a line to finally be drawn? And why did it happen when it did? Not earlier, not later, but right at the peak of visibility. That answer lies in what came next. This section is complete. Say go when you're ready for Chapter 2, where we explore the first real consequences and the quiet domestic shift that no headline ever captured. Go Chapter 2, when consequences entered the room. Unto 000 plus words. What happens when the thing fueling your public success starts threatening your private stability? That's not a hypothetical. That's the turning point. Because the moment consequences enter a story like this, everything changes. Tone shifts. Energy recalibrates. Silence becomes louder than outrage. And in this case, the consequences didn't arrive through headlines or social media backlash. They arrived at home, quietly, relentlessly, without cameras. Here's the uncomfortable truth most people never consider. Public consequences are survivable. Private consequences are not. A controversial segment can be defended. A viral backlash can be spun. A professional fallout can be reframed as martyrdom. But a shift in a marriage? That's harder to narrate away. This is where the timeline becomes crucial. Because while the public believed the feud was escalating toward its loudest point, something else was happening in parallel, something far less visible, but far more decisive. The emotional temperature at home began to change, not dramatically at first, not explosively, subtly, and subtle changes are often the most dangerous because they're easy to dismiss. A pause where there used to be enthusiasm, a look exchanged instead of a comment, a conversation redirected, small signals, but signals nonetheless. Here's what insiders later described as the disconnect phase. That moment when the commentary continued publicly, but the response privately began to cool. Not because the fixation had ended, but because the cost had finally become undeniable. Let's talk about cost. Cost isn't just measured in careers or reputations. It's measured in emotional bandwidth. How much space does one subject occupy? How much energy does it drain? How often does it intrude? When one name repeatedly dominates attention, it inevitably displaces something else. And displacement creates resentment. This is where spouses often reach their limit, not out of jealousy, but out of exhaustion, because obsession, even when framed as criticism, is still obsession. And obsession has a way of consuming rooms. Picture this. A conversation starts about something mundane, plans, schedules, daily life, and then, almost reflexively, the same subject re-enters again and again. At some point, the question stops being, "Why do you care?" and becomes, "Why can't you stop?" That question doesn't need to be spoken to be felt. And when it's felt often enough, it changes the dynamic entirely. This is where the first real boundary appears. Not a public boundary, a personal one. A boundary that says, this is affecting us now. And once a partner recognizes that a public fixation is bleeding into private space, the response is rarely gentle. It's corrective. That correction might come as distance, as withdrawal, as silence. Silence, in many ways, is the loudest signal of all, because silence means someone has stopped engaging with the narrative you're still trying to perform. And when that happens, the performance suddenly feels hollow. This is the moment when consequences stop being theoretical. When commentary that once felt justified begins to feel heavy. When the applause fades and the room feels empty. But here's where the contradiction intensifies. Instead of de-escalating immediately, the public tone hardened. Why? Because people often double down right before they change course. Doubling down is a defense mechanism. If you admit the behavior has gone too far, you must confront why you let it go that far in the first place. And that confrontation is uncomfortable. So the response becomes louder, sharper, more absolute, until it can't be sustained. This is the psychological pattern most viewers misinterpret as strength. But it's usually a sign of instability. Think about it. If someone were truly confident in their position, they wouldn't need to repeat it endlessly. Repetition is reassurance, and reassurance suggests doubt. Now, let's zoom in on the specific moment where things began to shift irreversibly. It wasn't one comment, it wasn't one broadcast, it wasn't one headline. It was accumulation, accumulated tension, accumulated fatigue, accumulated realization that something had crossed from professional obligation into emotional entanglement. Again, not in the sensational sense people rush toward, but in the sense that emotional energy was being spent where it no longer belonged. And once that realization crystallizes, priorities shift fast. This is where insiders notice something telling. The language softened, not publicly, but privately. The confidence wavered, not on air, but off. The fixation didn't disappear overnight, but it lost its momentum. And momentum is everything in media narratives. Without momentum, outrage collapses into noise. So what caused the momentum to break? According to those close to the situation, it was a conversation that forced a reckoning. Not a dramatic ultimatum, not a threat, a mirror. A moment where the behavior was reflected back, not as commentary, but as impact. How it felt to live with it, how it affected the atmosphere. How it reshaped emotional availability. That kind of mirror is devastating because it strips away justification. It reframes the story from me versus the world to us versus this. And once something becomes the third presence in a relationship, it's only a matter of time before someone asks it to leave. This is where things get interesting, because when the private world demands change, the public world often resists it. The audience still wants spectacle. Producers still want conflict. Algorithms still reward outrage. But the emotional cost has already been paid, and once it's paid, the appetite for repetition evaporates. This explains the sudden recalibration that confused so many observers. Why the tone shifted, why the silence grew longer, why the energy drained from what once felt combustible. People asked, did the feud end? That's the wrong question. Feuds don't end. They dissolve. They dissolve when the fuel source disappears. And in this case, The fuel wasn't disagreement, it was emotional investment. Once that investment was withdrawn, redirected back where it belonged, the public narrative lost its charge. But here's the part most people never consider. Withdrawal isn't painless. Detaching from a fixation feels like loss. It creates a vacuum, and vacuums demand explanation. This is why, in the immediate aftermath, confusion reigned. Commentators speculated, fans theorized, critics accused. But the truth was far quieter. The consequences had already done their work. The line had been drawn, not for the audience, but for the marriage. And when a marriage draws a line, everything else becomes secondary. Yet even then, the story wasn't over, because withdrawal doesn't erase what came before. It simply reframes it, and reframing invites scrutiny. In the next chapter, we're going to examine what happened when the silence itself became a story, when absence sparked more speculation than presence ever had, and when the quiet recalibration raised questions no one could answer, not with clips, not with commentary, not with outrage, because the loudest clue was what wasn't being said anymore. And once people noticed that silence, they began asking a new question. What exactly happened behind closed doors to make it necessary? That question leads us to the next phase, the phase where implication replaced accusation and the audience began connecting dots the media never confirmed. This section is complete. Say go when you're ready for Chapter 3, where silence becomes suspicious, and the absence of commentary tells a story louder than any broadcast ever could. Go, Chapter 3, when silence became the lewdest statement. Chew, 000 plus words. What if the most revealing moment in this entire saga wasn't something that was said, but something that suddenly stopped being said? Silence has a strange effect on audiences trained to expect noise. At first, it feels like relief, then confusion, then suspicion. Because when someone who built momentum on constant engagement suddenly disengages, the absence doesn't feel neutral. It feels intentional, and intention invites interpretation. This is where the story entered its most unsettling phase. Not the loud phase, the quiet one. For years, commentary had followed a predictable rhythm. A headline appears, a response follows, clips circulate, outrage spikes, engagement soars. The audience knew the beat. Then one day, the beat faltered. Not completely, not dramatically, just enough to feel off. Questions began to surface in comment sections and private industry conversations. Why isn't he responding to this? Why does this feel different? Why the pause? Pauses are dangerous in media. They create space for speculation, and speculation, unlike commentary, cannot be controlled. The silence didn't arrive all at once. It crept in. A skipped segment, a softer remark, a moment where the expected escalation never came. At first, viewers rationalized it. Maybe he's busy, maybe producers shifted priorities, maybe this cycle has moved on. But the cycle hadn't moved on. The subject was still generating headlines, still polarizing audiences, still igniting debates. And yet, the reaction had changed. That mismatch is what triggered suspicion. Because silence in the face of provocation is rarely accidental. It's strategic, or corrective, or enforced. And that's when the theories began. Some speculated professional pressure. Others suggested exhaustion. A few whispered about legal caution. But those explanations didn't fully satisfy, because exhaustion doesn't explain selectivity. Legal caution doesn't explain emotional recalibration. And professional pressure doesn't explain why the shift aligned so precisely with private changes already noticed by those close to the situation. This is where silence stopped being neutral. It became a signal. Signals don't speak loudly. They speak consistently. And the consistency here was undeniable. The same topics that once triggered instant reaction now passed without comment. The same narratives that once fueled outrage now barely registered. When engagement drops without external cause, it usually means something internal has shifted, and internal shifts are almost always rooted in consequence. Remember what we established in the previous chapter. Public backlash can be weathered. Private disruption cannot. So when silence enters a story like this, it often means the cost-benefit analysis has changed. The question is, changed how? This is where things get psychologically interesting. Silence doesn't just communicate withdrawal. It communicates awareness. Awareness that something went too far. Awareness that lines were blurred. Awareness that continuing would cause more damage than stopping. But awareness is uncomfortable because it forces reflection, and reflection invites reinterpretation of the past. Suddenly, moments that once felt justified start to look excessive. Language that once felt sharp starts to feel personal. Repetition that once felt righteous starts to feel obsessive. That retrospective discomfort is often what fuels silence. Not because the person wants to admit fault publicly, but because they've already admitted it privately. This is where the audience begins to feel unsettled, because silence doesn't provide closure, it withholds it. And withheld closure creates tension. The tension grew as people noticed something else. The silence wasn't evenly applied. Some topics still received commentary. Other figures still drew reaction. But this one subject? Muted. Selective silence is the loudest kind. It suggests intention. And intention raises the most dangerous question of all. Why this topic specifically? This is the point where absence became narrative. Media analysts began dissecting what wasn't said. Fans began replaying older clips with new perspective. Critics began reframing the feud not as a battle, but as a fixation that had finally reached its breaking point. And when reframing happens, narratives collapse fast, because reframing changes who looks in control. Silence flipped the power dynamic. Suddenly, the subject who once seemed perpetually reactive appeared distant. And distance in these dynamics often sig.